The facts are this. In 2024, the Economic Policy Institute shared that women are paid less than men at every education level. Women are paid 18% less than men in general. And of course, that gap is wider across Hispanic and Black women when compared to men. The Center for American Progress in 2024 reported that nearly one in four, that's about 25% of LGBTQI plus adults, reported experiencing discrimination in the workplace in the past year. McKinsey showed us that 85 women, only 85 women are promoted for every 100 men that are promoted, even though that McKinsey's multi-year research found that companies with greater than 30% female executives tend to outperform those with fewer female executives. If you're here at this session, likely this is not new news. Specific numbers, perhaps, but you know this to some extent. You see this. You may even be feeling this, experiencing it firsthand, or at the very least, you know someone who is. Now, the title of our session here is Don't Call It DEI, a new approach, a new way forward for leadership. But in reality, these are the same principles for engagement. The only difference is the jargon. Employee engagement has not changed. The principles have remained the same. And those principles tell us to ditch the labels and embrace the humans. Because here's what else are facts. Several research shows us that when diversity is balanced with inclusion and psychological safety, the chances of having creative thinking and creative problem solving skyrocket. In 2023, Gallup reported that organizations with robust inclusion and diversity and belonging practices see a 22% higher productivity rate and 27% higher profitability. Deloitte showed us that diverse and inclusive cultures are 6 times more innovative and agile. More facts, 56% increase in job performance is reported, 50% reduction in turnover risk, and 75% decrease in 6 days, sick days. And the facts go on and on. When diversity is balanced with inclusion and psychological safety, the chances of having creative thinking and creative problem solving skyrocket. And right now, it may seem that we're moving away from that. In Q1 2025, SHRM reported that incivility is costing companies $2.1 billion. And in Q2 2025, similar, same amount, $2.1 billion. Now, here's the thing, you might be saying to yourself, yeah, but Vanessa, turnover is low at my company. Listen, employees are staying. Okay, sure, they're staying, but are they working? Because in 2025, Gallup released their State of the Workplace report. And it shows us that perhaps turnover is low, absolutely, at your company, but is the engagement still high? Globally, engagement has decreased by 2 points, similar levels to what had happened from 2019 to 2020 at the peak of the COVID-19 lockdowns and shelter-in-place orders. So yes, the turnover at your company may be low. Employees are staying, but is it because you're great to work at? Or is it because there are just less jobs in the market for them to apply to? There's more uncertainty in the job market. So they're just optimizing and focusing on what's happening right now. Recently, Bamboo HR reported that 53% of workers are implementing what they call work barriers. So they're holding close to that project. They're like, ooh, if I hold on to that project, then there's less chance of me getting fired. And there's more importance that I see more important to the work if I just hold on to it. In today's session, we're going to be going into how can you as an HR leader really create a welcoming and respectful workplace and help your leaders to create that welcoming and respectful workplace for all. Before diving in a bit further, just want to share more about me. So I'm known as a business defibrillator, and my focus is on leadership, well-being, and development for all. And so I have a team of trainers, coaches, and facilitators as part of my firm, LiberationX Contracts. And we've been supporting private and public sector companies for many years. And in terms of my case, these words are a lot for you. These are just some logos of just my professional background and experience, and essentially have supported and been doing lots of work with organizations with my consulting firm for the last 7 years. And so that's a whole separate set of clients and things. But this slide here is just logos to describe more about my professional background. Or if you prefer to look at all the words, you're welcome to read that too. So now let's get into it. Now, the numbers I shared that Sherm had shared, this is the workplace and society at large. But what are your experiences in your workplace? I want you to take the time to reflect. During the last 5 years at work, I'm going to share some examples of uncivil behavior. And I want you to think about which of the following types of behavior that I'm going to share have you personally experienced at your past workplaces or at your current workplace? Disrespectful communication, being interrupted, dismissed, or ignored, or spoken to rudely. Exclusion and isolation, being deliberately excluded from meetings, conversations, or activities. Gossip or rumor spreading, being the subject of malicious gossip or rumors. Microaggressions, subtle, often unintentional expressions of prejudice or discrimination. So think backhanded compliments, assumptions based on identity. Passive aggressive behavior, indirect expression of hostility or opposition. This looks like potentially procrastination, forgetting commitments, giving you the silent treatment. Undermining or sabotage, someone deliberately hindering your reputation or opportunities. Excessive criticism or nitpicking, constantly finding fault, even in minor things, with the intent to demoralize. Favoritism or nepotism, unfair treatment or opportunities given to others based on personal connections rather than merit, or even given to others based on perhaps the leader's trust in that team member. Bullying or intimidation, aggressive, threatening, or coercive behavior. Blaming or scapegoating, being unfairly blamed for problems or mistakes. Withholding information, where key information is being deliberately kept from you that impacts your work. Public shaming or humiliation, being chastised or belittled in front of others. Aggressive communication, yelling, shouting, or using an overtly aggressive tone. Unfair workload distribution, being consistently given disproportionately less work than peers. Have you experienced any of these? Now, of course, that was in the full set of things, the full set of incivil behavior. But have you experienced any of these? I know for me, in my experience, I've experienced several of these. There was a time I experienced gossip and passive aggressive behavior from a coworker. We were on the same team. This was a couple of years ago, about 7 years ago. But we were on the same team, and as a coworker, he had a clique at the workplace. He had a clique going on, a group of people who we really connected with. And me and this coworker, our projects never really crossed paths. We were on the same strategy team, but our projects never really crossed paths. But I started noticing about 6 to 8 months into this role, I started noticing that him and his group of friends suddenly they didn't see me in the office or in the hallway. It seemed, they kind of just would walk by me. I didn't really get high anymore or smile, And I said, interesting, just interesting. So what I did was I scheduled time with him and we met up in the lobby cafe, having some dialogue. I just wanted to learn more about what was happening, or maybe I was just going crazy, right? And we had a discussion, right? So I said, "Oh, I've noticed that it seems like you feel a certain type of way about me." His response, "No." Whoa. I said, "Sure, just." And then we started discussing and having the dialogue. And that's when I learned about what was happening. You see, on the team, I was experiencing promotions, I was getting raises, and he did indeed feel a certain way about that. Because at the end of the day, we had the same boss. And we both had a mutual disdain for our boss. See, but I was experiencing, praises and awards and bonuses, and he wasn't experiencing the same type of sort of appreciation in the workplace. So on his end, there was some sort of favoritism that I was experiencing, right? Or that our boss favored me more. But in reality, what was happening was our boss was the same boss to him as was for me, right? He was a bad boss. But I was essentially taking ownership of my career and was responsible for the different things and different rewards that I was experiencing. And so it's very interesting how we were experiencing the same instances with our boss, but in different ways. But in my end, it was gossip and passive aggressive behavior. Now, here's what happened though. After that conversation with my colleague in that cafe, He clearly told his coworkers and clique about it, so to speak, because then what happened the next day, I was getting highs in the hallway. People were seeing me in the shuttle, saying hello to me in the kitchen, in the work kitchen. And so that's the way I address that, right? There's been more times as well too. There was a time when I experienced public humiliation and aggressive communication from a manager as well. This was way back, even prior to that prior experience that I share with you, where she threw a temper tantrum, anxiety attack over a missed sentence in a work scenario. Now I addressed this and I brought this up, to my sort of work counselor at the time, and she dismissed it. Now, ultimately, this manager, apparently, this wasn't the first time she had done this to someone on her team. I wasn't the first person, I wasn't the last. And so eventually she was fired through this a couple years later. But I've experienced several of these examples and more. And you probably have your own instances of this. And if this was a not a pre-recorded session, I would have invited you to share some of this. But I want you to really take the time to just reflect on these. And I want you to understand, right, the reason why I bring this up is for you to understand that you're not alone. These examples and these instances happen quite often, unfortunately. But the fact is that inclusion creates growth. Inclusion creates growth for the self, for the individual, for the close knit community that we call either family, friends, or your team, and growth for the company. And it's unfortunate that we've had these experiences because at the end of the day, what do we all want? What does everyone want? Whether you're a white, cis, heterosexual man, or you identify as a transgender woman, what do we all want? Psychological safety, meaning the space to feel safe, welcomed, and accepted. And what can get in the way of this psychological safety was all the things that I listed out. All that incivil behavior gets in the way of that psychological safety that we all want, that we all experience. So the question when we think about how do we embrace the human side of us all, right? What is this approach to leadership that we need to consider? Is how do we help all feel safe, welcomed, and accepted? What are the key principles of that? Now, through my work with clients in various different ways, with public sector, private sector, in my work essentially with Fortune 500 companies to even small businesses and startups, there are three key principles that tie all this work together when it comes to helping us all feel safe, welcomed, and accepted. When it comes to the opposite of the examples and instances that I share with you. And those key principles are empathy, empowerment, and equity. Now, the next couple of minutes, I'm talking about what that looks like. And then we're going to go into some example scenarios and different phrases that you can think about to implement this in real time and in real life for yourself and for your team. So, empathy, think about the power of the pause, active listening, right? Now, this is stuff that you've heard about in the past. How do we listen to understand, not reply? How do we ask open-ended questions? How do we validate feelings? Empathy comes down to understanding each other. Empathy comes down to taking a step back, right? And that's where the pause comes in. Taking a step back to just consider, okay, what now? What is this person thinking? Yes, perhaps, like initially we have that moment of frustration, disappointment, anticipation, annoyance, shock. But taking a moment to pause, sit in that feeling and say, okay, but maybe this person didn't mean it this way. Maybe they're not actually attacking me. Maybe they're not actually, trying to get in the way of my progress or success. This is partly essentially when I talked about the dialogue that I went with a coworker a couple years ago. This was what I was thinking about. Now it's difficult, very difficult to approach someone and have that, schedule a meeting and have that dialogue. This is before, I had ChatGPT or Google Gemini or, AI to tell me how to have a conversation. This is way before all of that. Now we have those tools, but ultimately it's taking a moment to say, you know what, maybe this person didn't mean it that way, or maybe it's not what I'm seeing is not necessarily what is actually happening, or maybe what I'm seeing or how I'm interpreting it. Because a lot of the times it's our mind and our thoughts that are just adding words and filler instances to the observation. And sometimes it's not right. In the case of my prior employee, in this instance, it was right. But sometimes it's not right, right? And when you take that moment to pause, take that moment to consider, okay, maybe I'm observing something, but the way I'm interpreting the observation is not accurate. Let me just take a step back and let me just have a conversation with myself and have a conversation with the other person. Sometimes in those moments, it leads us to have a different reaction, a different scenario, a different way of being and relating with our teams. And so as an HR leader, think about can you develop that empathy with your HR managers? Now, later on, I'm going to go into some additional tactical interpersonal strategies, more than what I just already shared, but empathy, right? One of the key principles, empathy. Then we go into empowerment. So empowerment, it's when someone comes knocking at your office, coming at your boss, like, hey, I feel as though I'm not getting opportunities on the team. It seems as though, John or Elizabeth, they seem to be favoring, giving projects to Tiffany or Paul. I feel like I am not being valued or appreciated. Well, what you can do in that moment is bring that leader and manager to have a constructive conversation and really think about asking that manager, specific person that you're always turning to, perhaps on the team, and why is that? Because when we think about the end of the day, assuming everyone went through the same interview process, then and everyone was hired for a reason, then technically everyone is capable of doing that something. So, as HR leaders, the question of empowerment, right, and teaching empowerment for our managers or even for senior leaders, executives, is thinking about how can we help them delegate more strategically across the team? How can we help them think through growth mindsets and providing growth opportunities? Because even in instances and situations where perhaps, there's always a specific person that's being turned to, maybe it's because they know it, they have that skill set, but maybe the other person does not. And that's totally fine. But as all research and engagement shows us, right, people want to grow, people want to develop. They want to have opportunities to learn new things, to not be stuck in boring routine for 30, 40, 50 years. And so training our managers to look for opportunities or to be open, not even to even look for it, to even be open to opportunities where their team members and employees are able to take on a new project or even shadow someone else in a new project as well too. But also empowerment looks like offering constructive feedback and coaching and ensuring that our managers and teams are able to do that more effectively. Because when they're more open to giving constructive feedback or to even coaching their team members and employees and staff, having that allows them to be more open to people doing new things. Because sometimes, yes, when they do a new thing, they're going to fail at it initially. But if that manager, if that VP, if that director is open to giving that feedback and coaching people through the failures, so it can become a success or a win later on. And when the team members feel like their leader is offering that constructive feedback and providing that growth opportunity, that employee feels more empowered to try new things, to ask for growth opportunities, right? To seek them out. Empathy, empowerment, and then we have equity, the third key principle of psychological safety. And this comes down to how can we be more mindful as leaders to be aware of our biases? So, as an HR practitioner, as an HR leader, as an HR executive, when people are knocking on your door, you have the opportunity you're the outside person looking in. And so the question becomes, how can you help those that are coming to your door, knocking on your door, right? How can you help them be aware of any unconscious biases that they may be approaching the situation with? And most of the time, the skill set that's needed is the pause. It's giving the opportunity to pause, to check themselves before they wreck themselves. And aside from that, It's looking at what are some standardized processes that we can put into hiring, promoting, and giving feedback. Like a popular workshop that I deliver is called Thriving with Neurodiversity, Strategies for Creating a Workplace that Supports not only employees with ADHD, but essentially neurodiverse employees and all. And a key part of this workshop and training that I deliver is really ensuring and helping people to think through different interview strategies, for example. Because someone with an ADHD mind or neurodiverse mind is not going to interview in the same way that a neurotypical mind is going to interview. They require more pauses in there before they respond. The eye contact may not be there with you because they're all in their thoughts in their mind. I know that happens to me a lot, for example. But what are ways that we can standardize processes, but also train people on the different ways that neurodivergent minds or people with different life experiences show up in the workplace? Then we have allyship and mentorship. You've probably heard of an ally or heard of a mentor, but think about even in your own life, in your own experience. Was there ever an instance where you had someone who was a mentor in your life, right? They essentially took the time to pull you aside after a meeting or took the time to sit down with you on a regular basis, whether it's quarterly or weekly, to share advice or to point out, so you know that meeting that you were in last week? Here's the thing. Someone to give you and to show up for you. But even at the end of the day, allyship is also about the person in the room who advocates for you when you're not in the room. And so encouraging people to build those relationships in the workplace, right? We don't need everyone to be the best friend. We don't need everyone, not every employee needs every single leader to know who they are, but it's ensuring and helping them to build those relationships of people who are advocates for them, whether it be giving them advice on how they could be more successful, or whether it be actually speaking up for them when they're not in the room. Empathy, empowerment, and equity. So I'm going to share the scenario. If we were, if this wasn't pre-recorded, we would be discussing the scenario. But I want you to just consider the scenario here. Imagine a team meeting where one person is consistently interrupting others. If you think about the three principles, empathy, equity, and empowerment, which principle would you say is being undermined in that team meeting? And thinking through what's one quick thing that you could do in that moment. So it's a team meeting where one person is consistently interrupting others. What is the key principle of the ones that you see here on the screen? What is the key principle that is being undermined here? And what's one thing that you can do in that moment? So I'm gonna give you some time just to think through that for yourself. Think through that example. And think about what would you do in that moment? Or what have you done in the past, but what can you do moving forward? And we're gonna go through some additional examples as well too. So I want you to think about either write it down or take a note on what you would do in that moment when in a team meeting where someone is clear that someone has been interrupted. I'm thinking about another scenario. A team member shares an idea and others immediately shut it down without exploring it. When it comes to empathy, empowerment, and equity, what principle is at risk here? And what's one quick thing that you could do? So a team member shares an idea and others are immediately shutting it down without exploring it. What principle is at risk? Just jot down, take a moment, jot down what principle, empathy, empowerment, equity do you believe is at risk? And what's one quick thing that you could do in the moment? Now, for the first example, where we shared a team meeting where one person is consistently interrupting another person. If we look at the three key principles, which one is being undermined here? Empathy, empowerment, or equity? Well, if someone's consistently being interrupted, the empowerment, right? The empowerment and a little bit of the equity as well too is being undermined here. Because what happens is when one person is being interrupted, when that person that's being interrupted, they know they're being interrupted. They feel it on a regular basis. And so what happens is, they may have in that moment felt brave enough to share their voice, but now they're constantly being interrupted. Chances are they're not going to share their voice anymore. They're going to feel as though their voice doesn't really matter. They're going to feel as though their thoughts, their opinions, their ideas aren't really valued by that person who's interrupting them on a regular basis. Bye bye psychological safety. And then we think about the instance where the team member is sharing an idea, right? So now they're not even being interrupted. So they've had the opportunity to share an idea. They're not being interrupted. They've gone to the end of their idea, and then it's immediately shut down. There's not even an expiration of it. It's just immediately shut down. What principle is at risk here? Right? The principle in that moment is also the empowerment, but also even the empathy as well too. Where the team members are not necessarily actively listening to that person's idea. And empowerment because, well, it wasn't even addressed, right? Their idea wasn't addressed. Again, it's shutting down the voice, silencing the person. But now we think about the other question. What's one quick thing that you can do in those moments? We're going to go into that during the second part of this session here. Okay. The beauty, though, is that empathy, empowerment, equity. Maybe you thought of an instance where this happened, even maybe today or even last week in your team, and you did not do anything. You just sat there and just it happened. That's okay. Maybe you've had someone come to your office, right? They're knocking on your door like, "Hey, I was interrupted. I keep getting interrupted in this meeting. I don't understand why." Da 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 da. And so there might be a leader, perhaps that you know of in your office, that does this. They constantly interrupt people on their team, or they have a reputation for not valuing the ideas of perhaps women, perhaps. And the thing is that no matter where someone is today, when we think about growth mindset, the beauty is that these principles can be taught. We can all grow and develop. That troublesome director, executive, VP, manager can grow and develop as well too. Part of that, though, is that they need to want to grow and develop, right? The first part is them wanting to grow and develop, acknowledging that they need to grow and develop. So my team and I, we love doing, having 360 assessments. We think 360 assessments for our clients are really great because it helps the leader kind of see from other people's perspective what's actually happening. And when a leader gets that 360 feedback, and actually acknowledges what's being said, right? And they get, instead of being defensive and they acknowledge what's actually being said by others, it's the start of a beautiful journey of the growth that can happen for them. But the reality is, and the reality is, the reality is, right, that there are challenges. There are challenges to empathy, empowerment, and equity in the workplace. Right. It's all the challenges that I shared about. And some of these challenges you can control for, and some of them you cannot, right? People are going to bring their life to work. They always have been and will always continue, right? There are things happening outside of the workplace that you cannot control for. But what we each can control for is ourselves. And so when we think about addressing these challenges, it's looking into how can we show up from an interpersonal perspective. So two of the challenges that I'm going to touch on, right, next couple minutes are microaggressions and unconscious bias. And what are ultimately microaggressions and unconscious biases? It's those moments, those instances when we subconsciously or consciously allow wrongful assumptions to get in the way of our interactions with each other. And a lot of times that can create a lot of the silos, conflict, and communication that occurs in the workplace. Over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to go into some interpersonal strategies that our clients have found successful. And it's going to be also a handout and a job aid for you as well to take with you that you can scan the QR code and have that for reference, print it out, put it in your desk, etc. But I want you to first think through for yourself. Think about a time when perhaps you witnessed a microaggression or some sort of exclusionary comment. It could have been in a larger team meeting, it could have been during a one-on-one, but you witnessed this. As an HR person, you witnessed a microaggression or exclusionary comment. What made it difficult for you to speak up in that moment? Just think about an instance when this happened. It could be recently, it could be many years ago. But what made it difficult for you to speak up in that moment? Because yes, the reality is that when these things are happening in the moment, it can be difficult to speak up, right? To either be an ally or speak up for yourself or to speak up for other people. And you might, walk away from the meeting and say, OMG, like, oh, did someone so just say that? Like, did they actually mean that? Oh my God, what do I do? And you might try to ignore it. But the thing is that the more instances that we ignore in the workplace of these moments, the more distrust that occurs in the workplace. Because ignoring it does not eliminate that it happened. Ignoring it does not erase that it occurred, especially not for the people who are involved. And so what happens is when, let's say, that person, right, eventually it keeps on happening, well, they eventually leave the company and someone else comes in. Ah, but that leader's doing the same behavior, same thing is happening, same assumptions. It creates this cycle where a workplace or a team or a department or a leader is no longer a psychologically safe space. But of course, it's difficult, right? In the moment to speak up, it is very difficult. When you witness something, when you hear something, it's like, Vanessa, I paused, but I don't know what to say. Or what do I say? How do I say? I don't want to seem rude. I don't want to get fired or miss out on opportunities, right? Some of the common reasons that we don't say anything or that make it difficult for us to speak up is the internal struggle, right? We had the internal struggle. Am I overreacting? Was that actually as bad as it sounded? Then you have the social risk. Will this make things worse for me or for the other person? Right? Will I get fired? Will they get fired? Then you have the unpredictable outcome. Well, let's say I say something. Is it even worth it? Is it going to change anything? Will there even be an apology? Like, what is it even worth saying anything? And that question, is it worth the effort? That depends on you, right? I'm gonna let you answer that question for yourself. My personal opinion, given the work that I do with my clients, is that yes, it is worth the effort. Whether you're being an ally, whether you're speaking up for yourself, it is worth that effort. Is there a risk? Absolutely. Speaking up is not an easy thing. If it were easy, everyone would be doing it. So there is risk. And there are experiences that I've had, and maybe even you watching this right now have had, where you spoken up, and there's been some retaliatory actions because of that, perhaps. But if we actually care about inclusion and belonging, right? The word DEI, if whether or not you use it or don't use it in your workplace, that does not matter. What we're talking about here is creating a space where all feel safe, welcomed, and respected, creating psychological safety in our teams, in our departments, and in our workplaces, in your team, in your department, in your workplace. If you care about that, then yes, it is worth the effort to speak up. So what can you do? What can you say? So on the next slide here is a QR code with a job aid. And in this job aid includes essentially different examples and quotes and things, which we'll go through as well. So I'm going to include 4 different examples and instances of different scenarios. And I want you to look through and refer to this job aid. And I'll share my screen as well too of it as well. And just look through and just think about what can you say in those moments, right? And it could be what's on job aid. It could be some other variation of it, right? It's all about tailoring it to, your voice and your preference. But take a moment and just scan this QR code and give some time for you. Maybe need to pull out your phone or whatever it may be. And also share my screen as well for this. I want you to take a moment, scan this QR code for the phrases. Okay. Now I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with part of the handout that has the phrases in it. And we're going to go through some examples. So what you should be seeing right now. So on my screen right now are essentially different instances and things. And it's kind of essentially, this is the bottom half of the job aid, looking at different things that you can say in different moments. So the first part, for example, if you're immediately looking to challenge microaggressions or exclusionary behavior, right? Here's something you can say. Could you explain what you meant by that? Help me understand. What's funny about that? I'm not sure I understand the point of that comment. Can you just elaborate? When you say, right, so you can insert whatever it is that they said. When you say, insert what they said, what are you implying? And then we think about instances where, right, and then the other two examples are instances where, perhaps you have a voice that's a little bit stronger and louder in the meeting than others. And so when you're looking to seek out diverse perspectives on decisions to facilitate balanced participation in meetings, some of you consider is saying, before we finalize, is there anyone with a different point of view or dissenting opinion that they'd like to share? Or who has an alternative approach or concern we haven't addressed? And it's something that's very powerful that you can instruct your managers, VPs, and directors to do in their workplace is to also regularly check in with individual team members. This is a powerful tool that can be used to get an understanding and a sense of belonging and support that the team member is feeling. Now, I will note that what happens is this is more impactful, in a psychologically safe environment where that person can open up. But sometimes you may not be experiencing that right now, but in regularly checking in, right? This is where this is the hard work that's needed. This is the hard work that's needed to build the culture where you have to do it regularly, right? It's not one and done. Oh, you asked this person today what was going on. They said they were fine. Okay, great. Now for the next 2 years, let's not check in with them, right? This is regularly checking in and ensuring that your VP directors and supervisors, when they get promoted, they're getting trainings on how to regularly check in with individual team members, right? Me and my team love doing this as well, right? But it's providing that foundation and base and benchmark where at the very minimum, managers, directors, people, anyone with direct reports should be checking in with those direct reports and just what is going on. Even something as powerful as 10 minutes where you check in with that person makes a difference because it shows that direct report that someone is thinking about them as a human, not as an output. Like, oh, hey, is that project done? Is that agenda done? Or how's that meeting going? Or did we do that policy? Or oh, how's that building coming along? Is that pipe fixed? When the individual direct reports are being asked about themselves as a human, it puts something in their brain where they say, oh, I maybe this person cares. See, but it has to happen continually. Because the first time it's like, oh, maybe they care. I don't know. They never asked me that before. Are they trying to fire me? What's going on? Right. But if it keeps on happening the second, third, fourth, fifth time, eventually that direct report warms up to the idea of, oh, wait, okay, they actually care about me as a human. So training your supervisors and managers direct and VPs to do that for the direct reports is very powerful. And some of the questions that they can ask during these check-ins, on a scale of 1 to 10, how connected do you feel to the team and what can move that number up? Right? Is there anything that's making you feel more or less supported in your work? Right? Notice we're not asking about specific person. We're not asking about specific, project. We're just asking sort of a benchmark, just how do you feel? How supported do you feel in the work that you're doing? Or how connected do you feel to the team? Different ways for us to get to the empowerment perspective, but very powerful. So now looking at that job aid, I'm going to go back to the slides. The basis of these statements at the end of the day is curiosity, empathy, and humility, not shame. Because we are all human. We all have some form of bias within our minds. Right? Even I do. We're all humans and we're all learning. But when we keep ourselves open to the idea that we are humans, that we're all learning, we tap into the curious part of ourselves that is open to listening, that is open to pausing before we act, that is open to asking the question or considering the other perspective and other point of view, that is open to the idea that perhaps we don't have all the answers. And maybe the answers will come through conversation. So we'll go through a couple of examples here so you can just see kind of how you can use the job aid in your day to day. So you're in a meeting and you hear someone says during a team meeting, that's a crazy idea. But then again, what do you expect from a millennial? So look at the first half. Someone says during a team meeting, that's a crazy idea. But then again, what do you expect from a millennial? Right? That generational bias. It's a separate training that I deliver. But this does happen, right? Where what do you expect from a baby boomer? What do you expect from, insert generation here? Well, if you look at your handout, right, what is something that you can say? Right? If you take a look at the job aid, well, you say any one of these four. Could you explain what you meant by that? I'm not sure I understand the point of that concept. Can you elaborate? Is this something that's about us millennials? I may have missed that comment. When you say something by millennials, what are you implying? And I invite you though, sometimes in some situations, one of the you may or may not have heard of this, but it's called calling in method. And the calling in method was developed by Dr. Loretta. And ultimately, it's the idea that, sometimes perhaps in the meeting, depending on who's in the meeting, depending on who's in the call, depending on who's saying what, you may want to essentially have this discussion outside of the meeting. But I share these statements as ways for you to consider how can you in the moment just lightly just help the person consider their comments. Help the person consider what they said in the moment. Right? We're not trying to shame people. We're not trying to make people feel guilty. We're just trying to just understand, right? Have an empathetic perspective and view on what could be happening. Okay, the next example. Someone says about your supervisor, it's okay. Technology can be hard for your generation. Again, same statements can apply here as well. Like, can you elaborate? Like when you say it's hard from a generation, yeah, right. And I think a lot of times what happens is we try to, bypass these comments and bypass these statements. But think about if you're someone who is hearing this and you're hearing it on a continual basis, because chances are if it's happening, if it's being said that one time, it probably was said at some point in time before, and it probably will be said again if not checked, right? If not corrected. And so it can be, and so it's one of those things where, again, it goes back to that question. You might be thinking to yourself, is it worth the effort? Depending on your outcome, depending on the results that you want for the culture and team and the engagement of your employees, yes, it is worth that effort. Here's some other two instances that may come up. You hear someone, or you're essentially just in the kitchen, in the workplace, or maybe you're in a chat function or in a Teams or a Slack channel conversation, and someone says about your colleague, she should try to be nicer and smile more. Maybe this even happens during the development conversation, the annual development conversation. She should try to be nicer and smile more. Now, we know different biases that this comes from at the end of the day. And so, what can you do to address that? Any of those four statements apply, right? And there are more things as well, too. And I encourage you, especially, I know a lot of you have AI tools, right? I encourage you to look into, typing into ChatGPT, Google Gemini, whatever AI tool that you use, Copilot, whatever that you use. But there are many different statements and things that you can say in this situation. And sometimes these things do come up. Like I know for me, I was working for a firm way back. This was 2018 or so. And one of the things that was said about me was that I should be nicer and smile more, right? And this was then my essentially direct supervisor at the time shared this with me. And I said, interesting, interesting. But then a couple years later, it was very interesting because then what did I hear? The opposite feedback that I heard at a different company. So I was at a different company. I'm smiling more. And I was being told the feedback that I was then given was, you know, Vanessa, yeah, I mean, I appreciate her enthusiasm, but yeah, it makes me worried about her ability to present, because it's just very, very enthusiastic. Sometimes the statements that we hear that other people are saying from other people, right? I challenge you to question it. Because a lot of times it's these statements that then are getting in the way of someone else advancing in their career. And they're microaggressions and biases where, we're expecting the she, that pronoun that has to be nicer or smile more. But why is that? Right? Be curious and think to yourself, why is that? But also challenge the other person. Like, oh, should she be nicer? Is she a little intimidating? What's happening here? What is the actual right? How can we actually go into the observations of things versus because nicer, smile more, right? These are more like adjectives, more descriptive words, more judgments, right? Judgment calls. But training your manager, your leader, your supervisor, and VPs to get more to the actual observation. Like, was there something that she said specifically that may not have, been nice, so to speak, or kind or polite, right? Was there a certain moment where maybe it was the email or a handoff of a project that was not received well? But why is that? What was the observed behavior versus the judgment call that was made? Or perhaps you hear someone say, maybe you're on an engineering team or something like that, and someone says, "Oh, we're just talking about some complicated stuff. You wouldn't be interested." Oh, when you say I wouldn't be interested, why do you think that? Right? So let's go back to the handout. Right? That phrase there. When you say I wouldn't be interested, well, why do you think that? What is some of that complicated stuff, perhaps? Right. And this is not stuff that's meant to be antagonistic, right? We're not trying to attack someone for their thoughts, but we're essentially allowing an elaboration of the thought so that they can also potentially think about what did I mean by that, right? Like, what did I mean by that? Like, what am I actually trying to say? And it's having that open dialogue. And sometimes what happens is you may not be able to speak up for yourself, but in being an ally, can you be an ally and speak up for someone else, right? And as HR leaders, in theory, we are everyone's ally, right? As a CHRO, as a VP of HR, even if you're an HR manager of one person at your company, right? You are considered everyone's ally. It's kind of like expected that you're kind of representing and speaking up for people. And so, how can you, when someone is knocking on your door or knocking on your office, how can you, if they say she should try to be nicer and smile more, what do you mean by that? Getting them to get to the root, the observed behavior versus the judgment call itself. Is it worth the effort? Well, if you're looking to build a space and create a space and a culture in which all feel safe, welcomed, and accepted, right? If that's the culture that you want, question mark, then it is worth the effort. And so think about this job aid here. You're welcome to, keep it for yourself, right? There's a QR code there from a couple minutes ago. You're welcome to go back and get that QR code. But there are various different ways, right? And this was just kind of just a touch on different things, different considerations. And there are many different strategies out there as well that you can do and employ for and train your managers on to look at how can they be more and employ more of those key principles of empathy, empowerment, and equity for their teams, for their direct reports, for themselves as well too. Because sure, turnover may be low at your company, but its productivity still high. We want engaged employees. We don't want just people who are cashing in the paycheck. We want people who are there, engaged, who want to be at work, who are inspired and motivated to work on what it is that they're working on, who feel safe enough to show up as their authentic selves 100% of the time. And part of that work in building that culture where it all feels safe, welcome, and accepted is looking at building in that empathy, empowerment, and equity. I know for me, I've been a full-time traveler for the last 22 months. I started on my journey. Well, by the time you watch this, it might be essentially a little bit over 2 years. But I started on my journey of being a full-time traveler. And it was not until recently that I realized the journey that I was really on at that time. Because what happened was a little bit earlier this year, I was in Seattle in a beautiful house. Oh, the house was beautiful. It was, new decor, new countertops. Like it looked like it was just remodeled. Is what this house looked like. And but there were other guests in the house. And they're high quality appliances. But I realized and learned that as great as a house can look on the inside, it's the people in that house that actually make it a home. And so I ended up, choosing a different location. But the journey that I realized that I've been on for the last 2 years was looking for that home. And I now have many homes in New York and West Palm Beach and Thailand. I'm so grateful to have options where, when I say options, it's places and spaces where I feel as though I can show up as my authentic self, where I am welcome, where I feel safe, respected, and welcomed. When we're spending more than 60% of our time in a space with a group of other people, whether you're working remotely, hybrid, or in person, we want a home. We want to feel welcome, respected, and to belong. You want that. Well, guess what? Everyone else, your team wants that, your leaders want that, the employees who you represent as an HR leader, they want that too. So is your office going to be a workplace? Is it going to be a home or is it going to be both? You get to decide that. And inclusion is a part of that. Whether or not you're using the word or not, guess what? Employees, engaged employees equals higher productivity and higher profitability. And psychological safety is what helps to shape that. And we know from various research that top talent, they're looking they're looking for the culture at a company. That's how you stand out in the workplace. That's how you stand out as an employer is looking at what is your culture, right? When the top talent is interviewing and doing informational interview and reaching out to people who currently work in the office, in the company, what are those people going to say? Are they going to say, get out, run? Are they going to say, oh, you know what I appreciate? I appreciate the people I work with. A culture of inclusion and psychological safety improves engagement even when all the internal headwinds are getting in the way, even when all everything else is happening with the change, with technology, with tariffs, with AI, when all these changes are happening, it's that culture of inclusion and psychological safety that keep people engaged, that keeps their morale high, that helps them to foster that resilience that they need to keep moving forward with your company. So let's ditch the labels and embrace the humans. A workplace, a home, or both. You decide. Thank you for taking the time here. On your screen now is a chance and opportunity for you to share feedback. We'd love to hear your feedback on what you thought about this. And please mention that you were watching this session here with part of Tennessee Sherm. And I'm also going to be there in person at the conference. So I hope to see you as well. Feel free to say hello to me if you end up seeing me. And I look forward to reading and seeing your feedback and happy to connect with you as well on LinkedIn. I'll put my links here as well too. So you're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn as well, or send me a note or email if you're interested in more information, if you have any questions on what is that shared here today, let's connect, let's stay in touch, and we'll love to have your feedback. I'll go back to that slide, well, here as well. So QR codes, feel free to scan that, share feedback on what you thought about digital labels, embrace the humans, and how can we approach leadership moving forward. Thank you again. I look forward to seeing you soon.